Hello and welcome to The Extra Mile. I'm Linda BOUDREAUX. Our guest today is Kevin Bell. Kevin is the president and owner of National Foundation Repair, and we're going to be talking about foundation issues and concerns and myths, and we're going to kind of get everybody all on the same page or all on one track when it comes to our foundations. Kevin, welcome back.
Good to see you again, Linda.
You too. I always like talking about foundations only because I'm so confused by them. You know, and everybody's got one. If you're living in a house somewhere, you got a foundation, right?
Yeah, it's a subject, we don't learn about it until you have to. It's not an exciting subject, obviously.
And you don't want to learn because you don't have to go there.
Yeah, it's like some dreaded disease.
Really,
we just don't, why learn about it until you have to?
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions about it. There's a lot of misconceptions that can lead to devaluation of our property. I mean, we tend to be cynical and we fear what we don't understand, and so that obviously we offer less for a home. We may ask less for our home. We may make decisions based on some information that's not always accurate, and it can hit us in a pocketbook sometimes. It can hurt us financially if we're not careful.
And that's part of the reason that we talk about this, is because it is something that I don't know where you go to get the information very easily, but it is. I mean, it's a big deal. So when we're talking about our foundations in our homes, what really are we talking about here?
Well, there's different types of foundations, obviously. But basically it's what connects our living area to the ground. I guess that's a good way of stating it.
Okay, so it can be a slab, it can be a pier, it can be any of the above?
Yeah, it could be, back in the early 1900s and through about mid-century, foundations were primarily built with crawl spaces, with individual piers resting on the ground, and the foundations were made out of wood. And there were whole sorts of problems that could result from decay or termites. In addition to the fact that a house could become unlevel, you had all these other issues. And then, as time wears on, we find out the advantages of having a hard concrete foundation. But then it's got its own set of problems that can happen.
Right.
But all foundations are resting on the soil, or they're resting maybe below the surface on some soil strata. And it's important that those conditions remain constant under our whole house. And the problem in this area, Linda, is we have a clay soil that shrinks and swells.
Here in Louisiana?
Generally speaking, yeah. You just don't find rock or sand when you dig a hole. You find clay, and that clay is very dynamic. It shrinks and it swells, and so it's really not a matter of whether we're moving, or we're moving evenly or unevenly. And we have a footprint on the ground that might, be 25 for 3,500 square feet in some cases. Mm-hmm. And the odds of that clay having the same amount of moisture in it, for example, may vary greatly from one end of our home to the other. So,
and that's actually a big deal, or can be a big deal.
That's probably the most common activity that we do. Repair techniques we employ are for problems generated from uneven moisture levels in the soil. We have a home that's been resting on a piece of earth for 35 years.
Okay.
And for 35 years, the doors were working fine and the walls weren't cracking necessarily. And then all of a sudden, one summer, that's not the case anymore. And it's not that the dirt changed. It's not that the dirt is different dirt. It's just that now part of the soil under part of our home is different. It may be a lot drier now because of the maturation of a big tree that wasn't such a big tree 20 years ago.
Okay, so there are a lot of things that can happen over time.
Right. So we have to do the best we can to maintain consistency in the soil under our home, I guess, is a good way to help prevent the problems we rectify every day.
So what are some of the big problems that foundation failure can cause? I mean, your house isn't going to fall down.
Very rarely see a house fall down. Getting back to wooden foundations, there's actually more devastating effects typically from decay You can have the wood just gets so damaged that it can't support your home. I mean, a home can rot from exposure to moisture. Concrete doesn't have that problem typically. It can do two things. Concrete foundations, generally speaking, it can come apart. A crack in your foundation, which is normal actually in most cases, can separate. Well, that's not necessarily normal. We don't want our home to be an inch longer than it used to be as the slab separates.
Okay, we're not trying to grow our house here.
No. So it's important that when the builder builds the foundation that problem be, and it is 100% preventable, by the way. It's important that the techniques be employed to prevent that problem.
Okay, so builders need to know, and I guess they do know for the most part.
They do. The learning curve, sometimes it can be really long, and builders can be in business and be quite prolific for a number of years before the first evidence shows up. And so and the liability is not but a few years in most cases. So in many cases, there's not much of an incentive to change techniques that aren't working as well as we'd like for them to. But then the second thing, which is a more common problem, isn't the slab separating as much as it is just becoming unlevel, meaning that part of our home is lower than the other part, whereas for decades maybe it was all the same. And that comes primarily from having, it can happen early in the life of a home, from site preparation when the builder comes in or the homeowner prepares his property to build the home. He does a lot of stuff. And we should wait a while before we build after we do these things, like bringing in a pad of dirt to build up our house, maybe so it doesn't flood. So we bring in all this soil, but we don't let it sit there for 5 years. We kind of wait a few weeks.
We want to get our house up.
We want to get it up. So that can allow early movements. But the good news about these site prep related activities like that is that over the long term, time tends to be on our side. The lot tends to stabilize, and our house actually may perform better when it's older.
Oh, okay.
But if a home starts to do this after being these issues, the symptoms of uneven settlement, if they show up years after a home's built, it usually means some new condition is just now developing. And that's usually, for some reason, the soil moisture levels have changed, where it could be a tree demanding more water. It could be drainage has changed to where now water collects and stays in an area longer than it used to. You can remove a tree that may have been there for half a century, taking a lot of water, and then all of a sudden there's no demand for water on that end of the home, and that allows the ground to swell. So I guess the kind of the moral of the story is that the ground's always doing this stuff, and when it's even, we're okay. When it's uneven, we start to have issues. We start to have the doors that rub and the walls that crack.
Okay. What happens if your foundation starts to shift and not do well and you don't fix it?
Well, in the case of the slab separating, which is a little more rare, that's a problem that unfortunately we continue to see more now than we used to. I hate to tell you that, but when you put a skeleton of steel, I like the word skeleton because it sort of describes that it's in there like the bones in our body and it's holding us together. And we see it all the time when they pour concrete, especially on the interstate, you see the big heavy bars.
Right.
Well, that's so when the concrete develops a crack that it's not going to separate.
Okay, it holds it together.
Holds it together. Okay. And if that problem isn't addressed and the slab is allowed to separate, you don't get that back. And we have plumbing running through there. And we have, imagine having a roof that's only, a fixed length of the room's 20 feet wide, but the slab separates an inch. Well, then that means the walls have separated an inch forever. We can't pull the house sideways back together, however we can connect it. So It's very important not to let that type of problem, it's called reinforcement failure. And it can be by design, where the technique that doesn't work well may be employed, or it can be a good technique that's just not properly installed. That steel that holds us together doesn't do much good if it's laying on the dirt under the concrete. It's got to be inside the concrete.
So you have to do it right.
Got to do it right. But that problem is actually preventable. Just a little diligence, we should never have that problem. And it is fairly rare, although more common today, I guess. The other type foundation problem that makes our house unlevel, Linda, if we don't do anything, the degree to which the home becomes unlevel just gets worse. And so the functionality is what really we fear, I guess, the most.
So
houses.
the doors don't close anymore?
Yeah, it just gets frustrating for us.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's strictly cosmetic, depending on the floor plan. Maybe it's just going to show up as in the form of cosmetic damage. In other cases, we have a lot of functional problems. The fear of collapse is usually not in play. It's not, houses don't, fall over typically. They may lean a bit. They may become unlevel. But,
Okay. Just kind of wonder what's going to be the worst case scenario
right.
here.
So I guess you either prevent the conditions or improve the conditions that are promoting that problem, or we have to do what we do for a living, which is we have to modify that foundation so that it performs better in the future.
Okay. Okay. And a fix is usually a permanent fix, huh?
Yeah, it's a permanent fix, but we are relying on typical sort of nominal conditions. I mean, we have to perform our services in an affordable way,
Yeah.
and making the foundation, for example, deeper will protect our foundation from extended dry periods. Because when the water table drops, when the soil gets dry, it tends to get dry at the surface first. Mm-hmm. So shallow foundations are at the mercy of the soil moisture levels and dry periods, maybe more so than deep foundations. But we're not making the foundation in an unlimited deep manner. We're just making it deeper.
Deep enough.
We're just making it deep enough for nominal conditions. But if we have an unprecedented drought, if we have a tree or group of trees that continue to grow and we don't do the right things and thin them out so the demand for water maybe goes down instead of increasing every year, then we do warranty work. I mean, we're set up to do warranty work. We do have to do warranty work. We want our clients to be educated. We want them to not need warranty work. And
You don't want to come back.
we don't want to come back. So we want them to do the things that will enable the new design we give them to perform in the best way possible. And so we want to, I guess it's like the doctor kind of does the surgery, but he doesn't send you home with no homework. You still got to change maybe your diet, or you have to exercise or do therapy, whatever. I guess that's a silly analogy.
It's probably not a silly analogy. We probably do have to take some responsibility and make some changes and adjustments.
Well, certainly having an educated about this subject, having a client that understands how it happened to start with is certainly in everybody's advantage.
Absolutely, absolutely. But, I guess one of the things, speaking of that, is I think there is a lot of confusion about this whole foundation deal. And I guess there are a lot of misconceptions and ideas that are just not really quite accurate, huh?
That is very true, and it actually not only is inaccurate, but it can actually lead us doing the wrong things. For example, there's a lot of common misconceptions. One of the most common ones, when we hear it every day, is, "Kevin, come look at my home. It's sinking on the end." Well, sinking is not necessarily an accurate word, although the end may be lower and sinking may seem like the accurate phrase. It sort of conjures up the image of something sinking into the ground.
Yeah, like in squishy mud.
Yeah, like a boat sinks, and and sooner or later you can't see it; it's below the surface of the water. But houses actually float is a better analogy. Well, if we think sink and we take it literally, we might be sort of more apt to let the soil get dry and hard instead of keeping it moist.
That's what I would do.
When in reality, we want the ground to retain moisture because the clay is swollen. And actually, our house, Linda, doesn't weigh enough to sink into the ground like a boat into the water or our footprint into the mud. The footprint of a home is too large for that. I'm speaking of a home with a slab foundation.
Okay.
So it tends to do what the soil under it does. And if the soil is drying out, then the foundation's going to go down if it rests on that soil. So sink is a bad misconception. I guess that houses sink, and it can lead you to making bad decisions about what to do during the drought.
Yeah.
Another misconception is we've mentioned trees a few times.
Yeah.
Well, obviously it's got to be the roots, right? And I guess it's the roots in sort of an indirect way. The tree is taking moisture out of the ground, and the ground becomes very dry. But it's not the specific result of a root or a group of roots. It's
coming in and attacking your house.
Yeah, the roots don't attack your home. They tend to be very shallow, actually, when you get away from a tree in our home. Thankfully, code requires our homes to have some minimal depth to them. So typically, there's exceptions to this, of course.
Right.
After 35 years, you're going to see exceptions. But typically, roots don't pick up houses the way they do a sidewalk.
Because that's what I vision.
Yeah, the roots. It's got to be the roots. That's what everybody thinks. But actually, the ground just gets so dry around a tree that moisture wicks over there. And if you were going to sop up a spilled soda pop or whatever, or Kool-Aid on a tabletop, the most effective way to do that's with a dry paper towel.
Mm-hmm.
But when our yard gets very dry, it effectively brings moisture into it in the same way. And so after 90 days or 100 days or with very little or no rainfall, the trees are affecting us, but it's not really specifically the roots. There are barriers on the market and have been forever whose purpose it is to stop root growth from point A to point B. And in many cases, they're shallow, and maybe it's made out of a herbicide or it's made out of some chemical that makes it difficult for the roots to grow through that.
Do we want to do that?
Well, that's something that if a tree's not hurting your foundation would be a great way to keep roots that bother you from growing into an area you don't want them.
Okay.
But if you're thinking that you're improving the foundation's performance by putting a chemical barrier, you haven't stopped the wicking of the soil at all from under your home into the yard around the tree.
Because the tree still is pulling water, even if the roots aren't all the way under there.
Exactly. The ground is
Okay.
dry from the tree, and it's the dry soil that actually brings the moisture in, you see. So just cutting the roots and keeping them from under our home, it does not overcome the effect of a demanding tree out in our yard.
Okay.
But there are other type barriers that you can employ that actually have a dual purpose. They obviously they stop the root growth, but they also enable the moisture level to build up on the house side. And that would be a barrier made out of something waterproof. And typically it would be installed deeper than the shallow barriers that are just sole purpose is to stop root growth.
And I'm just thinking about, I know you're not the tree guy, you're the foundation guy, but as we're doing this, are we weakening the tree, or do we?
That's a good question.
You know?
I wouldn't obviously be in a case to say
Right.
that we don't weaken a tree. I think most trees are kind of hard to weaken, some of them.
Okay, so
We don't know that we've ever killed one, but we're obviously not liable for that.
Right,
And
right.
You'd have to consult with an arborist or a
to
tree
see how
expert.
that's good. I'm just thinking you just don't want that tree falling over on your house either.
No, absolutely
You know?
not.
Which way is it going to go? You know?
Might be better to have foundation failure than a tree on your house. Sure.
So it's really managing the way that trees use water is what
Yeah,
we're really
the
saying here.
whole whether putting a sprinkler system in, and it doesn't have to be a sprinkler system. Whether watering your yard, you can do it with
a hose.
or the inexpensive type sprinklers you might buy at a box store somewhere. Whether it's watering your yard more, or whether it's preventing the moisture that you used to retain in the soil that's now being lost into the soil around the tree that's so dehydrated. Whether it's either one of those, you're just trying again. The goal is to just try to keep conditions on all sides of our home the same.
But in terms of like when we're talking about misconceptions, a lot of them seem to have to do with the fact that we need a certain amount of moisture in the soil. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, different type soils, Linda, have different ability to shrink and swell. And let's say, for example, a rock. Whether it's a dry rock or a wet rock,
It's still a rock.
It's a rock. It's the same size. Well, sand is like little bitty tiny rocks. These are called aggregate soils. And aggregate soils, the volume stays the same whether they're moist or whether the soil's moist or whether it's wet. But clay soil, on the other hand, is the particles of clay, when they get wet, they swell. And you can visualize, and we've all seen it, a dry spot in your yard in the summertime, it has a crack in the earth.
Yeah.
But you don't see those separations in the soil in February, March, and April of a typical spring. You just don't see them because the trees have kind of become dormant in many cases. The water table, we're getting rain more often, so the water table's higher. The temperatures are lower, so you don't have that baking effect.
Okay.
So the surface of the earth has got moisture, and that's a big percentage of our phone calls. And I tell people this all the time. It kind of seems funny, but it's from a business standpoint, it's not too funny. But our phone calls in the spring there's more never minds than there are come quicks. And the reason of the never minds are coming in is because people's homes are improving in many cases from the hydration of the soil.
So sometimes we don't need to have somebody come in and fix it. It will simply self-correct as the soil gets more moisture in it?
That is, again, from a business standpoint, how much I hate to admit that, but yeah, of course, being silly. That's exactly what happens. If we can sort of, over time, we may get back less than we lose, and we may end up with a permanent condition. After all, the tree does get bigger every year, and it takes more than moisture, by the way, out of the soil. But yeah, that's right. I think we probably, most of us anyway, have experienced, I know I have, a period of the year when the door doesn't fit quite right.
Right.
A crack in the wall looks a little bigger. And there's a lot of clues in that we just kind of overlook and we don't really focus on. But they're there. And the clue is, hey, my house performs better when the ground is wet after rain, and it seems to perform, differently when it's real hot and dry. And I'd rather have the way it performs in the winter and spring. So there's a lot of clues.
So, and I don't think people realize that. Because so much of what I always thought had to do with foundations, I thought it was more related to too much water or too much sogginess.
I guess the problem, to sum up, would be variations in moisture are the problem. The ground can only swell so much, and it can shrink, of course. The problem is when it's doing it in an inconsistent way, where one end of our home is holding water and the other end is losing it at the same moment. And that's when our house, that's exactly right, that's when we have this uneven movement. And we either have to change that reality or change our foundation design to live with that reality in a more effective, way. And so that would be, I guess, well-diagnosed and thought-out foundation remediation. That's what that's accomplishing. It's encouraging more even movement. Even though it's encouraging an inconsistent design, that's what that home happens to need.
And that's kind of what you like to do. You like to really kind of look at it, figure out what's going on, figure out what you can do to solve that problem, huh?
Right. I mean, it's certainly, yeah, absolutely. You definitely.
You're allowed to like that. It's okay. Because because there is a lot of diagnostic work that goes into this.
There's a lot of diagnostic work that goes in, I think, to the proper remediation, and there's always a best thing to do, and you have to make choices. We all want trees, and there's no built-in mechanism in our foundation when it's constructed to accommodate you putting a tree in. So years later, we find out what we really need, what our foundation really needs to have that oak tree. And sometimes it needs to be a little different on that end. It needs to be a little deeper. And that stuff can be diagnosed and properly addressed when the time comes.
Okay, so the problem really isn't necessarily overwhelming or something to just get totally freaked out about. It's like, once you see it, just deal with it.
There's no question that fear about this subject, and from ignorance, which is understandable, getting back to how we started the conversation, is the biggest fear.
Yeah, it's a scary thing to have to confront.
And that fear can lead to decisions that can cost us all money.
Okay, and we don't want to do that. So that's why you're here today. So let me just ask you this real quickly, because we talked a lot about trees. Are there certain trees that do better near our houses and certain trees that we probably...
I'm not going to be popular with the tree companies that sell trees, but absolutely so. Generally speaking, trees that take less water per day are more innocent. And that would be
innocent's an interesting word choice, but...
Yes, that's right. That is an interesting word, probably the wrong word. Trees that take less water are better. Like any magnolia. Magnolias grow slowly.
Right.
And Bradford pears grow quickly. And so a red oak or water oak may become bigger faster than a live oak. So when we pick the trees according to their rate of growth, typically I think that goes hand in hand with how much water they take. Again, okay. I'm not an arborist.
Right.
But there are certain trees that we shouldn't be planting very close to our home unless we're really prepared for the consequences. And it's the fast growers that hurt us, I think, more than the slow growers. If we're putting something near the home to shade a window, a big shrub is a better choice than a small tree.
Okay.
And let's leave the big majestic oaks for maybe way off in the distance.
Further back in the backyard or near the road.
That would be an ideal plan.
So people that are building homes or starting to landscape now can kind of take this all into consideration and maybe avoid problems down the road. Is that a fair thing to say?
We would feel good contributing to that, maybe. Yeah, that'd be great.
So in the last 30 seconds or so that we have, what's the takeaway from today's show, Kevin?
Well, certainly we're going to always have enough work out there, but
right.
It's not.
Yeah, you don't need to drum up business.
And we certainly don't want to be working on homes where there's other solutions that are better. It's not a black and white subject. The remedies are The cause of the problems need to be considered to ensure the future performance of any home.
And addressed, huh?
And there are certain structural changes that can be made that obviously help out in that situation. But when in doubt, call. You always give us a shout.
And you'll come, you'll do an assessment, and you'll tell people what they need to know.
We'll do the best we can.
I have confidence. Thank you so much for
Good seeing you
coming
again,
and sharing this again with us. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Always a good refresher. Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
Kevin, and thank you for watching The Extra Mile.